nobody felt that they could question it. But I'm really frustrated because everybody hated it and everyone keeps passing the buck to someone else. Well, why didn't so-and-so do something? Why didn't so-and-so do something? Why didn't the head of Nickelodeon? Why weren't they sending people to see if everything was okay? Why wasn't somebody else doing something? And my question to you is, why weren't you doing something? You're like, well, I couldn't do anything because then I jeopardized my career. But you want somebody else to jeopardize their career and say something because you say, well, I have to protect myself. Well, that's what the other person thinks too. They think they have to protect themselves. So why is it incumbent upon the other person to rise up and find a moral backbone and to find the courage to do it, but you can't be bothered to do it? Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Denise. Today we're going to do the 4th episode of Quiet on Set, and this is going to be a shorter episode because there just wasn't as much content in this episode that was really new, just to sort of wrapping up the story. We do start this episode talking about Drake Bell, which had been the point of the entire last episode. And you'll recall that at the end of last episode, I had talked about the sentencing of Brian Peck. Now, you'll recall from the last episode that Brian Peck was the predator who took advantage of Drake Bell, who built a friendship with him, who ousted his dad, who groomed him, then took advantage of him, and went on and on and on for a long time because Drake didn't know how to talk to the adults in his life about what was going on. And it took his girlfriend's mom stepping in and saying, hey, why is Brian Peck so involved in your life? Why won't he leave you alone? Why is he always around? Drake finally felt that somebody had noticed that things were off. He felt for a long time that this secret was something he couldn't discuss because no one seemed to notice that anything was wrong and he didn't know how to bring it up. In the last episode, I really did not go as hard against his mom as I felt, mostly because I had heard Drake Bell talking about how there's been so much negativity towards his mom and he doesn't have any animosity towards her for what happened. But if you watched the last episode, it's hard to figure out how he doesn't have animosity for his mom when she did everything so wrong. And I think that this potentially may not have happened if his mom had not been so antagonistic against her ex-husband. Because her ex-husband had told her, when he passed off the responsibilities for managing Drake, that Brian Peck was a real problem. But Drake's mom didn't listen to the warning that Brian was a problem. And she didn't really want to be involved in the tedious day-to-day of driving her son all over the place for auditions and for various work things. So she let Brian take a huge role in her son's life because she just didn't feel like it. And I can't understand how she didn't pick up on the fact that this adult didn't always need to be hanging around her kid. There wasn't any reason for it. If they're not at work, why is this guy always showing up for Drake? It's one thing that he's always there at work. He kind of has to be. He could have made excuses, plausible sounding excuses for his presence on set. But to constantly be showing up outside of work wherever Drake is and always inviting him to do things, it's like, Brian, get some friends of your own age. Why? What? But his mom never seemed to ask any questions. And Drake is like, well, Brian was super convincing. It's not really my mom's fault. It's that he was so convincing. Well, but it is your mom's fault because she had been warned by her ex-husband to watch out for Brian's behavior. And because she'd never been on set and because she wasn't super involved in actually managing her son, she continued to not actually know what Brian was like when it was one-on-one. He was copping a feel here and there. So, well, I understand that Drake feels protective over his mom and feels upset that she's being really called out by commentators who are watching this show. I think that it is appropriate to note the fact that this would not have happened had she decided not to be so antagonistic with her ex-husband. If she decided to do the job of managing him more closely instead of parceling out that job to other people because she didn't like to drive into the city. And I'm glad that she called the police as soon as her son told her that something was going on and she didn't drag her feet about it. But what really was the alternative? I guess she could have been like Brandy's mom, who was like, I don't want anyone to think I'm a bad mom, so I'm just never going to say anything. But at this point, major abuses had gone on. Anyway, that was the end of that 3rd episode. And so this episode, his mother has called the police. He has documented the things that have happened to him. And at this point in the documentary, Brian has been convicted. But the wild thing is that when they go to sentencing, half of the courtroom is all there in support of Brian, even though he had been convicted. So it wasn't like, well, we have no idea what's happened. We have no idea what people are saying about him. He hasn't been convicted yet. Maybe he didn't do it. No, he'd been convicted. And this was just the sentencing portion. Drake says that his mom got up and made a statement to Brian about all of, a victim impact statement type of thing to Brian. But Drake says he got up, but he didn't address Brian. He addressed the packed side of the courtroom with many memorable faces and famous faces in it and said, I will forever have the memory of being abused at the hands of this predator. And you will forever have the memory of sitting here supporting and defending what this man did to me. So like we said in the last episode, there's all these people who now, especially now that this documentary Quiet on Set has come out, all these celebrities who supported him coming out now and saying, well, I didn't know and I wasn't given all the facts. And if I had really known, I would never have supported that. And there's truth to that for sure. I mean, Brian was pretty slick. And when he got people to write him letters of support, and there were scores and scores of letters of support, he didn't give them the full details. But even so, a lot of those letters are weirdly worded. Brian didn't do anything bad, and if he did, I know he feels really sad about it. One of them literally said he feels bad if he messed up. He didn't mess up. He viciously abused someone and tried to figure out a way to wiggle his way into his world and extract him from his parental support. It's not like by accident I tripped and accidentally fell into abusing you. What? There's all these excuses and, well, if he did do it, it's because he was tempted to do it. How does a 14-year-old boy tempt an adult man? Get out of here with this victim blaming. So the letters were super disconcerting that there was just so many people who were willing to support somebody and not just blindly support them, but say, well, if he did do it, there was a reason why. Even accepting that there's a possibility that he did do it. Well, he must have had a good reason. Is there a good reason to abuse a child? What are you talking about? And are you an abuser if you would say something like that? It's like, why are you defending the actions of this person? Anyway, so the documentary moves from the sentencing to what happened at Nickelodeon. So you would think that, we had Jason Handy, he got caught. Then 4 months later, we got Brian Peck. And by the way, the Jason Handy, Brian Peck thing is really problematic to me because Jason Handy was a PA and got 16 years in prison. And what he did was definitely wrong. He should have served every day of that prison sentence for sure. 16 years is fine. Because you prey on little girls, I hope you get put under the jail. But then here comes Brian Peck, who is super connected and has all of these friends and all of these people standing up for him. And you know what he got? 16 months in jail. Is that a joke? He did terrible things to Drake. It wasn't like he sent some inappropriate messages online, which are totally wrong. I'm not demeaning that what Jason Handy did and acting like it's no big thing. No, he should have gotten every day in prison. But you know what I think? I think that our justice system is broken and that if you lay hands on a child, that's it for you, life in prison. We don't need you out on the street. But not only did he get back out on the street, he got out and got a job at Disney. Do you hear what I am saying to you? Brian Peck gets out of jail, a convicted sex offender, and goes and gets a job at Disney. See, I can even excuse Nickelodeon for hiring Brian Peck. They wouldn't have found anything on a background check if they had decided to do an intensive background check, which they say they did. But yeah, they wouldn't have found anything. And Brian was very, very, very good at what he did, confusing people and making them think that he was a normal guy and then taking advantage of people. So I don't blame Nickelodeon, but I do blame Disney. How in the world are you going to hire somebody who has spent 16 months in prison for abuse of a child and then invite him onto your set where you're working with all these kids? Brian Peck went to go and work on, I believe it was The Sweet Life of Zach and Cody. Are you for real right now? So they decide that they're going to hire him. And then the rest of the show is talking about, well, what happened at Nickelodeon? They've had the child predators. And there was a third guy that they threw in there very sort of like randomly, but he was some guy on set who brought a child on the lot and abused the child on the lot. And so it's just one after another. There's 3 people in short succession that Nickelodeon was dealing with, but it didn't stop production. It didn't slow things down. They just kind of swept it under the carpet and the engines roared on. And if anything, Nickelodeon became even more popular with even more popular shows like Victorious, Zoe 101, another one called iCarly. All of these shows were top content for tweens in the early 2000s. And they were just pulling in ratings like crazy. At the same time, Disney was also, their star was rising as far as the competition with children's television. And Disney had shows like The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody and Hannah Montana. So this was it was a time for children's programming. And the guy at the helm was Dan Schneider. If we thought that he was popular before, he was the absolute golden boy, but with the power came more harshness. So the rest of the documentary is really just cataloging all of his abuses on set and more of the same, more screaming at people, more belittling people, making sure that you screamed at somebody so much that everyone on set could hear that person being belittled. It wasn't enough to just pull you to the side and say, hey, could you not do that? It would just be, I'm going to eviscerate you in front of everyone so everyone knows what an idiot you are. And the tensions were high. And because he was a bully, there was a lot of other bullying going on because that was the culture on set. A lot of whispering, a lot of ostracizing people, making people feel like you didn't want them around, enjoying their discomfort. And not only was that becoming a problem, but also the shows on Nickelodeon, there was continuing to be this real over-sexualized tone. And you didn't see that so much at Disney. But at Nickelodeon, there was lots of the kids doing things that were weird, and where the innuendos used to be like, is that an innuendo? Now it was just straight up, I can't really see this any other way. And we've talked about this before. Ariana Grande was in this position as doing things that were weird and awkward, gross, and sexual. And we've talked before about the time when they show her squeezing these potatoes and kind of moaning about give up the juice. And then just it's like this really weird scene. Other scenes where she's laying on the bed, pouring water all over herself as she lays half off the bed, saying how thirsty she is. Shots where people are getting stuff like goo all over their face. They did that a lot, spraying people with goo on their face. And just lots of licking things, just weird, odd things, like people trying to put their own feet in their mouth so they can suck on their toes. It's like, but why are we doing that? Why? It's gross. So anyway, whereas with Dan at the beginning of his Nickelodeon career was just a big, silly, fun kid, now he's at the sweet spot where he is the big man on campus. He has all the power, but it doesn't seem like it's made him any nicer. If anything, he thinks he has to keep outdoing what he did before, and he believes that his big personality and his sort of abusive way of dealing with things is actually an asset to why all these shows are doing so well, because he, knows how to get the most out of his people. And nobody felt that they could question it. But I'm really frustrated because everybody hated it and everyone keeps passing the buck to someone else. Well, why didn't so-and-so do something? Why didn't so-and-so do something? Why didn't the head of Nickelodeon? Why weren't they sending people to see if everything was okay? Why wasn't somebody else doing something? And my question to you is, why weren't you doing something? You're like, well, I couldn't do anything because then I jeopardized my career. But you want somebody else to jeopardize their career and say something because you say, well, I have to protect myself. Well, that's what the other person thinks too. They think they have to protect themselves. So why is it incumbent upon the other person to rise up and find a moral backbone and to find the courage to do it, but you can't be bothered to do it? I got really, really, really annoyed by how victimized everybody was. It wouldn't stop. Everyone was so mean. It was so hateful. Dan was hateful. The crew was hateful. I hated it. It's like, okay, well, if you hated it, then you have to do something about it. And just because you're like, we all hated it. Okay, well then collectively, y'all all get together and do something. If you're afraid of sticking your neck out, but everybody's miserable with you, then let's all rise up. They can't cut everybody's heads off at the same time. it just seemed to me like enough already of the complaining and of the looking back and being like, well, it was such a terrible place, but I didn't have the voice to speak. Then the Me Too movement happens. And then everyone's like, oh, well, now I can say something. Okay, sure. Now you can. And I'm glad for anybody who felt that they didn't have a voice before. I'm glad that they feel like they found one. And I'm glad that they did something, because it was as a product of the Me Too movement that Dan Schneider was effectively kicked out very abruptly. Now, there had actually been a little bit of a movement towards, hey, it's an abusive situation here on set. We don't like it. We don't like it. We don't like it. And that effectively removed Dan from the floor. He wasn't allowed to come out on set anymore because people are like, it's a hostile work environment. And then with the Me Too movement, there became a ton more people reporting, being like, yeah, I hated it also. And then that's when Nickelodeon just cut ties with him abruptly and was like, you're not even going to be a part of these shows anymore. So he had brought Nickelodeon to the peak pinnacle of where it ultimately was. And then he was kicked out the back door. I think if I were him, I would have been a little bitter, because I would have been like, how come nobody was complaining low these many years? And now suddenly with the Me Too movement, y'all all have something to say. And I sort of support that feeling. I'm not saying he should have been abusive or anything like that. It's unacceptable. That's not the way an effective boss works. But it is a little bit annoying when everyone gets galvanized at the same time because of a movement that they think will support them. Y'all should have been creating your own movement to change the quality on the set instead of waiting for somebody else to give you permission to say something. I don't know. This last episode kind of got on my nerves a little bit, because it's everybody just wringing their hands about how bad it was. But I believe it was bad. All I have to do is see some of this footage of some of the stuff they're doing, having the kids do, and acting like it's for a kid's show. I mean, if that is supported and was aired on Nickelodeon, what in the world was going on behind the scenes? And there's lots and lots and lots of background film of Dan going up behind people, scaring them, him getting like way up in people's personal space. People always look uncomfortable around him. And I don't think it's just because he screamed a lot, but because he was always like wanting to be all over you, like put his hands on you. Oh, and that's the other thing that people didn't like. This was like one of the Me Too things. Dan always wanted these massages. He was always calling up people from the wardrobe department or from this department to come and give him a massage. It was always like, there was always a woman behind him massaging his shoulders. And it wasn't something you could refuse. You felt like you had to do it when he called you up. Even if you were in the middle of something, some enormous project, and he called you, you had to drop what you were doing and come and massage his nasty shoulders, his neck, his head. It's really gross. It's like, honestly, like some of the pictures that, and he's just laying there like a fat toad while people like are massaging and kneading his fat. It's disgusting. All I'm saying is that's gross behavior. And do you need somebody to give you permission to say, I hate this? So Nickelodeon is without their golden boy, and the documentary sort of ends with talking to each of the child stars that they had addressed at the beginning to sort of just say, how did your time at Nickelodeon affect you? And of course, many of them had self-esteem problems. Many of them went into adulthood questioning their self-worth. A lot of them are really torn up when they weren't invited back to Nickelodeon, because as a young kid, it's like, this is the first time that you find out, oh, I'm replaceable. There wasn't actually anything special about me. They didn't even want me back. Then there was the kids who had escalating problems beyond just self-esteem problem. Lots of alcohol abuse, lots of drug abuse. Drake Bell had a terrible spiral. There's issues with addiction and wild behavior. There was bankruptcy and all of these things that eventually led him to seek therapy. Right before he went into therapy, if I'm remembering the timeline correctly, he was actually got in trouble for messaging somebody who was only 15 years old. Now, he says he didn't know how old she was, and as soon as he found out how old she was, he completely cut off communication with her. But all that drove him into therapy, and he got intensive therapy and grief therapy and trauma therapy. And so I think he's a much more healed person today. But you still see in his face, I mean, there's a sadness in his eyes. It's really sad. And at the end of the documentary, it's him and his dad talking, and they're actually sort of walking away from the camera. And he says to his dad, it's hard and it's sad being here and talking about all this stuff. And his dad says, well, there's a better day tomorrow. And he says kind of sadly and wistfully, yeah, people keep saying that. And that's the end of the documentary. And it leaves you kind of sad and just sort of depleted, feeling like, well, is anybody going to do anything about any of this? I mean, knowing about it is great, but then now what? Now what? And I think the now what is just don't let your kids be involved in this. And I think that it doesn't matter. I mean, Hollywood there's always been predators in Hollywood. We've always known that's the way things function there. And the idea that we are going to suddenly change an industry that was well aware of its problems because there's a documentary, I don't have a lot of hope. But I think that it's just astounding that all of this stuff could be going on. And now, this happened in like 2004. 20 years later, we're finding out about what was happening. It's unacceptable. So that's the end of that series. Now, you guys, I have plans for us for later this week. I'm going to watch the Netflix documentary about Harry and Meghan, and we're going to have ourselves a little conversation about that. What do you think? I'm excited. Okay, I'll talk to you later.